Should be live on YouTube now. Okay, hello everyone. We're just going to take a moment here to get to the top of the hour and let people into the room. Thanks for joining us today. I'm just making sure we've got our recording going, YouTube audience in place. Okay, looks like we're in business. Welcome to the Friday webinar, everyone. I'm Executive Director for Conservatory Canada, Derek Auger. And today we're going to have George Litterst. You can see him on the screen there. He's going to give us a presentation on composer Ignatius Sancho. And it also relates to his Super Score app at Time Warp Technologies. George is no stranger to our audiences here for the Friday sessions. And I'll just go a little bit over what we plan to have coming up here in the coming weeks. George is going to be back with us next Friday as well on December 8th, and he's going to be joined by Arthur Uhl, and they're going to talk about the music of Muzio Clementi, specifically the Opus 36 sonatinas, and talking about the difference between the different versions and how the final version that gets published today is perhaps not at all in some cases what was intended. And so that promises to be a really fascinating discussion. I'll hit you all in your inbox next week with links to that if you haven't already registered. But that's going to be our final webinar for 2022. We're going to take a few weeks off over the holiday because I know all of us get quite busy around that time. And then we're going to be rejoined on Friday, January 12th for our first webinar of the new year. George is going to come back and join us for his third in his little series here. He'll be joined by Stella Sick, and together they're going to be talking about the waltz, the history of the waltz, complete with all sorts of interesting information. So you'll all have links to that shortly. And then going into January 19th, the Friday after that, Eleanor Gummer and Cecile Desrosiers will be with us, and they're going to talk further about music by women composers. And that takes us toward the end of January. Stay tuned. We've got lots coming up in January through February, and I'm now booking webinars into March. So I'll give you more ideas on what's to come there, and including some other special announcements in the new year about various things that we're undertaking here at Conservatory Canada. So without further ado, I'll just turn this over to George here, and he's going to go through his presentation. You should see his slideshow shortly. And I hope you enjoy. If you have any questions in the meantime, throw them in the chat box or in the Q&A. On those of you that are live with us on Zoom webinar, those of you that are watching live on YouTube on the CCTV channel, YouTube channel, you can't ask questions, but feel free to post comments there if you feel inclined to do so. So George, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm finding myself this week not in my home studio, but in an unusual location. And if I have a brief, unexpected interruption, I'll just apologize for that ahead of time. So today we're going to be talking about a remarkable composer named Ignatius Sancho. This is a person with whom I had to become acquainted. Just a little bit of a background here. Going back maybe even just 5 years, if somebody had said to me, hey, George, do you teach any of the music by that African English 18th century composer? I would have said, what are you talking about? And if he had said, oh, I mean that one, whose portrait was painted by Thomas Gainsborough, I would have said, what planet are you from? Well, there was such a person. His name was Ignatius Sancho. He published 5 different albums of music, and I've been finding music of his to be really quite delightful with my early intermediate to intermediate level students. And today we're going to specifically look into pieces from this album called 12 Country Dances. But we're also going to be taking a big look at the history here to understand who this man was, how it was that he was born into slavery, grew up in slavery in England, became a free person, a passionate advocate for the abolition of slavery, the first African in England to vote in a parliamentary election, and so forth. But just as a kind of a teaser introduction, I'm going to switch my screen over to my iPad, where I have a publication for which I've recorded the pieces. And I'm just going to play through this first very simple one. This is probably the easiest piece in the book, and give you a sense of just how delightful this dance music can be. And as you can see in the case of this piece, it's right in the pocket of some of the easier pieces of something like the Anna Magdalena Bach notebook. It fits in very nicely with literature that we're accustomed to teaching at this level from the 18th century. But it's from a person who's been neglected in the musical history books for sure. So, how did I end up getting involved in this? Many of you know me probably as a co-developer of a number of musical applications, SuperScore for iPad, Classroom Maestro, Internet MIDI, and Hymn Concert Extreme. It's been my work in SuperScore that's provided me with a remarkable opportunity to take the time to dig more deeply into music history, to look into the music of forgotten women composers, as well as Black and indigenous composers and other individuals of color. I am a performing musician and a teacher, and I'm finding that the riches that I have for myself to play and to for my students, it just has been growing and growing as a result of delving into these areas. So here's a portrait of the person we're talking about today. His name is Charles Ignatius Sancho. He basically would go by the two names, Ignatius Sancho. And in this portrait, where he's being depicted, it was actually painted by the very famous English portraitist Thomas Gainsborough. Now, today, I'd like to give you a little overview of what we're going to cover. I want to dig into this question, well, just who is this guy, Ignatius Sancho, and why should we care? He's not a person who is unknown to the history books. He was quite well known in the area of English culture and the history of slavery in England. And if you were to do research into just those areas, his name would come up. But obviously, digging into the musical history, his name is not likely to come up. We're going to look at compositions of Ignatius Sancho, particularly 12 dances from one particular publication that's uniquely for keyboard, called the 12 Country Dances for the year 1779. And then after we've gone through the history and then explored these pieces, at the very end, I hope I have enough time I can circle back and raise a couple of questions about, but what do we really know about this guy? Because there is a biography, as I'm going to explain, but evaluating a biography that was written, even a fairly contemporaneous one, is a different matter from looking at actual artifacts that support the narrative. And so I want to just sort of raise some questions about what do we really know here and how would we make some determinations about what we really know. And one of these pieces particularly stands out for me, and I want to show you at the end which one is my favorite country dance out of the group. And I've got a handout for you. Derek has it in his possession. If you were to acquire this particular album, the 12 Country Dances for the year 1779, in the SuperScore app on the iPad, it would be part of that. But if you don't have access to it that way, you may find this handout to be very, very helpful in terms of maintaining your information about the history of this remarkable person. So to talk about Ignatius Sancho, we really have to look at the broader context of slavery in the British Empire. In the 18th century, slavery was legal in the British Empire, as was the slave trade itself. There was quite an abolition movement that was growing in England in the 1800s. and I should say in the 1700s, which is the 18th century. And by 1807, the slave trade was finally abolished, but not slavery itself. Slavery itself was not abolished until 1833. Now, Ignatius Sancho died in 1780. I found on a research map a map of the London area around 1800, so this is a little bit after Sancho's life, but fairly contemporaneous, and it shows the black population in the London area. And as it says here on the left side of my slide, out of 1,000,000 people who were living in this area at this time, somewhere between 10 and 20,000 of them were of African descent. And they included actual British citizens, as well as slaves, soldiers and sailors, free black immigrants, and even a scattering of African royalty. We're going to be focusing our attention today on this area that I've highlighted in pink, which is in the southeast area of London, and it's the Greenwich area. So the reason that we know about Ignatius Sancho to begin with is the fact that after he died in 1780, a book dated 1783 was published of his letters. So this is a man who was born into slavery. He became emancipated, became very well educated, and was highly articulate, and just by virtue of circumstances ended up kind of hobnobbing with high society in England. And so he was no stranger to the movers and shakers of British society, and he had ongoing correspondence. And correspondence, as published in these letters, ranges anywhere from what he had to eat for lunch to very articulate expositions for what is wrong with slavery and why it would need to be abolished. Makes for very interesting reading. And the book was put together by a woman named Frances Crewe Phillips, who financed its publication through subscription. And 1,200 people subscribed to this, and this is how this book of letters got put together. And the remarkable part, which we're going to look at, is a preface that was included called The Memoirs of His Life by a man named Joseph Jekyll. Now, to understand what Mr. Jekyll has to say about Mr. Sancho, we need to learn a little bit about him. So I've got his dates up there on the screen. He was a lawyer, a fellow of the Royal Society, a member of Parliament, and at one point was even the Solicitor General to the Prince of Wales. So we can basically think of him as a rather authoritative individual. And so he writes this biography, and it starts off by talking about the birth of Ignatius Sancho. Now, this map does not come out of the book. It was from another source that documents the slave trade, but I've put it up here just to remind us all that slavery was moving from Africa to the new territories, the North and South America. From that west coast there of Africa, ships going to different ports as shown here on the map. And in 1729, according to Mr. Jekyll, Ignatius Sancho was actually born on one of these slave ships just a few days after it had left port. And it was headed to Spanish West Indies, but landed in Cartagena, which is the northern area there of modern-day Colombia. I've highlighted it there in a pink rectangle, not too far from the border of modern Panama. And according to Mr. Jekyll, he was baptized by a local bishop as an infant. His mother shortly thereafter died of disease, and his father allegedly was so distraught over this future of life as a slave that he committed suicide. So not a very fortunate beginning for a young infant, for sure. So this is another portrait, we think, of Ignatius Sancho, painted by Alan Ramsey. It's called Portrait of an African. It's a little uncertain if it is him or not, but people seem to think so. So I have that up on the screen. So to continue the narrative, Ignatius Sancho, at the age of 2, maybe 3, was brought to Greenwich, England, and was sold or given to 3 unmarried sisters. And there is a researcher who feels that she's identified who they are, that they were the sisters of the Earl of Dartmouth, and these are their names: Barbara, Elizabeth, Susan. I'm not sure how the last name is pronounced. And that family apparently lived right down here in the Greenwich area. Again, back to Mr. Jekyll. Ignatius Sancho is named Ignatius because of a suggested resemblance to the squire of Don Quixote, and was kept uneducated by the 3 sisters as a method of control. And when he was questioning authority, was threatened with a, quote, return to African slavery, which would mean sent to the New World to spend your life in the sugarcane fields, I believe. Now, these 3 sisters in the Greenwich area apparently lived not very far from the home of the 2nd Duke of Montague. And you'll see him over here with his wife, Mary Churchill. And through some means, the Duke of Montague became acquainted with this very young boy, became very interested in him, and provided him with books. And the history here is really kind of vague as to what he did, other than encouraged him to become educated. And he must have provided, I would guess, some tutoring or something, because you can't just give a person a pile of books and say, go learn how to read. But one way or another, in contrary to the way these sisters were bringing up this young boy, the Duke of Montague was able to facilitate an education. But the Duke died in 1749, so by that time, Ignatius is in his, 19, 20 years old. And according to the history, he flees the home of these 3 sisters and goes to the home of the wife of the Duke of Montague, Mary Churchill, and begs for her to take him in. And she presumably doesn't want to do this at first. He threatens he's going to kill himself, and she ultimately does take him in. And he ends up working there as a domestic servant. The history provided by Mr. Jekyll gives us no indication whatsoever as to what kind of arrangements, if any, were made to liberate him legally from the 3 sisters who owned him. But in any case, this is where he ended up. But Mary Churchill doesn't last that much longer. She dies in 1751. But she leaves Ignatius Sancho with an inheritance of 70 pounds, which was quite large at the time, and an annuity of 30 pounds. And so with that, Ignatius Sancho leaves the household, and he goes off and starts living the good life. He tries his hand at acting, and he apparently does a lot of gambling and who knows what other kinds of activities. But after some period of time, he does end up broke, and back he comes to the home of the Montague family, now becoming employed by the 3rd Duke of Montague. And exactly when that took place, we're a little uncertain, but sometime in the 1750s. And in that decade, he meets and marries Anne Osborne, who is a free woman from the West Indies. And they have a wonderful marriage together. In 1768, while he's accompanying the Montague family on a trip to a resort, the family has their portraits painted by Thomas Gainsborough, as does Ignatius himself. And in 1773, he retires from domestic service due to gout. But he's saved his money, and he's able to start a grocery business. And that means that he is now a man of property, and that's why he was able to vote in parliamentary elections. And during this time period shown on the screen, he fathers 9 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. So that's the basic history that Mr. Jekyll gives us. Mr. Jekyll gives us absolutely no information whatsoever as to the musical background of Charles Ignatius Sancho. Where did he learn to play or a musical instrument, assuming that he did, and where did he learn to compose? We just don't know. But he did publish 5 albums of music, several of which are for various miscellaneous combinations of instruments. I'm focusing on the last one, the 12 Country Dances for the year 1779, because they were set for harpsichord and they're entirely for the keyboard, therefore. And of course, they're delightful. All of these can be found, by the way, on IMSLP or at the British Library, which has these available online as well. So this is what the cover of the album that we're going to be looking at today looks like. And in very flowery language, it's titled 12 Country Dances for the year 1779, set for the harpsichord, by permission, humbly dedicated to the Right Honorable Miss North by her most obedient servant, Ignatius Sancho. And if I hadn't mentioned it previously, this publication was actually financed by Sancho himself. These are the titles of the pieces. We got Ruffs and Reeves, the Royal Bishop, Culford Heath Camp, Bushy Park, and so on and so forth. The pieces are typically named for locations that Sancho visited or for people that he knew, like Lord Dalkeith or Mary Montague. So it's rather common, I think, with these kinds of dance pieces to give them these kinds of names. I've organized them here on this slide to give you a little perspective musically as to what they cover. They are basically either in 6/8 time or in 4/4 time. One stands out a little bit differently in 2/4. And I would describe 2 different pieces here on the page as being the especially easy ones. And then I've got another grouping on the left that I say is, rather on the perky side. They're not exactly jigs, but they're headed sort of in that musical direction. And then we've got some perky ones and some stately ones in 4/4 time. And we'll be going through all of these today. But I want to give you one more little bit of background, this time musical background. We need to put in context that country dancing was a very important part of British life from at least the mid-17th century throughout the 18th century. And I'm showing here on the screen right now a picture of the cover page from a different publication that predates Sancho called The Dancing Master. And just as an indication as to how important dance music was of this genre in this period, this one, I'll point out, was published no less than 18 times between 1651 and 1728 by John Playford. And it consists of just dozens and dozens of tunes that became popular that people would want to dance to. And of course, over time, the exact mix of tunes in the book would change. This is a page of the Sancho publication, and this gives us a sense for what the notation looked like back at that time. It's a little more crudely printed than music that we are accustomed to playing from today. And interestingly, the dance steps are included as well. And at first glance, if you can read that slide, if you're on a big monitor, it may be a little hard to read. The S's look like they are F's in many cases, and there are just some oddities there as well as the whole flowery language. But I'll read some of this to you just to give you a sense of it. The first and second couple foot it and half right and half left. Foot it and half right and left it back again. Cross over 2 couples, lead up to the top, foot it and cast off. cross corners, half round, the gent going to the bottom, the lady to the top, etc. And so one could actually map this out and figure out how this would be danced. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to bring this up in SuperScore on my iPad so that you can hear my recording of it. And then we'll actually look at a little video of a group actually doing the dance itself. So give me just a moment to set things up here. So here's Duchess Devonshire's reel, and I've got it set up so I can skip most of the repeats. Skip that final repeat. So that's the Duchess of Devonshire's reel played on the piano. Now, in this edition that I've done, I have presented every piece twice. First, in a totally urtext manner, in which I've not added anything to the score other than what was there originally. And then a piano rendition where I have suggested slurs, articulations, and fingerings, and so forth. For the urtext version, I've made a harpsichord recording, and I'll just show you a little excerpt of this. And as you know, to make things come to life on a harpsichord where you can't engage dynamically with the speed with which you accelerate the key, you create musical interest through your touch, deciding where you're going to slur the notes and where they're going to be detached, and so forth. So I thought it was an important thing here to present these pieces in SuperScore in a manner that gave us a sense for how they would have been heard at the time. And then from there, we can work on ideas for moving the music over to the piano, the modern piano. And there's, of course, multiple ways in which to do that. The editorial ideas that are presented here on the score are simply mine, but they are a way in which to do it. Now, what I want to do right now is to show you a bit of this piece actually being danced. So this comes from a very nice lecture that I found online that presents a number of Sancho's pieces and couples actually dancing in this contradance manner in lines with constantly changing partners and so forth. Unfortunately, the audio that goes along with this video isn't great, but I'll play just a little bit to give you a sense of what the movement is like. And so forth. You get the idea. So the music is really quite a lot of fun, and dancing to it especially so. I happen to live in a little rural town of Rehoboth, Massachusetts, and several times a year, one country dance group or another of musicians will come into the local hall, and there will be a contra dance evening, and my wife and I have participated in that. There's a caller who will educate everybody to what the steps are intended for the particular dance, and follow along as best you can, much in the manner as what you just saw right there in the video. Okay, so I just need to get my list back up here in front of me, and we're going to go and take a look at a piece called The Royal Bishop. So this is the piano version. I'm going to do my best to start and avoid the repeats here. Let's take a listen. I'll stop it there. So I'd like to point out a couple of things. Again, if we were to compare to the text, there's not much in the way of articulations. This particular piece has more slurs in it than most of them do. But if we were to look at fingering that I have suggested, and I'm just going to zoom in here so we can look at a spot here in detail. The way things work out at the beginning of measure 6 in the right hand, you're going to end up playing that first G with the second finger, I believe. And so you might be wondering, if you're going to do second finger on G, third finger on A, and fourth finger on B flat, how can you possibly play down to F on the fifth finger? Has George lost his mind? Shouldn't that be the thumb? And maybe we've got to cross over to the note that follows or something like that. And this is an area that I would want to caution you on. If we were to compare these pieces to something like the famous minuet in G from the Anna Magdalena Bach notebook, yum ba da 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 dum bum bum. Many of those pieces, you could play a lot of the piece in a fairly legato manner if you chose. That just happens to be the way the notes lay out. But in these pieces, if you were to sit down and try to sight read, particularly from the urtext and fingered version, and play in a completely legato manner, you would find yourself getting all twisted up trying to do it, and you think, wow, these things are really kind of awkward. But if instead you take this more harpsichord mindset of gestures that create the sense of energy and vitality, and you're moving from one gesture group to another, and that your hand comes off the keys and then moves and lands for the next group, then fingering such as what I've put in the music starts to make a lot of sense. And actually the music, I believe, becomes easier and easier to play as a result. So that's just something I'd like to point out in terms of the way I have edited these. So that was that was the Royal Bishop. So we're going to go on and take a look at the Culford Heath Camp and see what style we have comparatively here. You'll notice here in Superscore we have these little balls that count off, and what they're intended for are count-offs so that if a student were practicing one hand and Superscore is going to play the other hand, you'd hear the count-off and you'd know when to come in and so forth. I've turned those off for now because we don't need to hear them. And I'm just going to move the cursor ahead so we can skip that first repeat. Okay, so this is Culford Heath Camp. and so on. That one has a fairly lyrical quality to it, but I have to say I really adore these that are in the compound time. I think they have a special quality about them. Bushy Park is another one in 6/8. And so you'll see that at the very beginning of this one, it's making it really big so it's easier for you to read here. Those repeated notes really forced a certain kind of articulation of the motive at the beginning. And I like that so much, I continued that idea throughout, even when there aren't repeated notes that force it. And I do think, especially in the harpsichord version, it gives vitality to the performance to play it that way. So that is Bushy Park. Now let's take a look at some of the tunes that are in 4/4 time. We'll start with the Duchess of Devonshire's Reel. Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. We've looked at that one. It's the Lady Montague's Reel. There we go. Make this a little bigger. Now, you or a student, of course, could go back to the word text version of this, and if you chose, go through a process of coming up with your own ideas as how best to articulate the theme. In this particular one, I chose to use quite a bit of staccato playing in the right hand, slurring primarily, at least in the first section, on the downbeats, and some other places in the second section. But those are the musical decisions that somebody really should make in order to pull off a good performance here. And as I'm showing this particular one to you, I'm reminded of a student who had worked on this not long ago, who is now working on the alla turca movement of sonata movement by Mozart. And the attention to detail that I was requiring of him in the performance of this piece and a couple others in this album ended up really paying off when it came to working on the Mozart piece, because those same kinds of demands need to be met, albeit on a much larger scale, many more notes, many more measures of music. But if you're not in the habit of right from the start paying attention to these things and building in the motor memory to do them, you're really going to spend your whole time just undoing what you've been mistakenly learning. Okay, let's take a look at another 4/4 piece that's rather a perky one called Trip to Dillington. And there's another repeat there. And of course, with all of these dances, if you were actually to play them in a dance situation, you'd probably mix and match sections and repeat multiple times and take opportunities for some personal liberty, embellishing the tunes, things like that. You can take these pieces and use them as starting points for your own creativity. Let's look at some pieces that are a little bit more of a stately nature. Windrod lasses. Now, when I say the piece is kind of perky or stately, this is, of course, my personal feeling about them. If you were playing them for an actual dance, you'd have to come to some sort of tempo accommodation that would work for the dancers or the person who's leading the event. And you'll notice there in this edited version, I've drawn a line from the appoggiatura in the right hand down to the bass note in the left hand as my guide for how I believe that ornament should be performed. We've got just two more before we go back to looking into a little history and then looking at my favorite of the bunch. Coming up next is Strawberries and Cream. And one of the things that I like so much about the fact that this album has 12 pieces in it, and that in the Superscore edition, the performances are included, both harpsichord and piano, that when I give my students an assignment, what I typically do is I ask them to go and listen to the whole set and make their own decision as to what they would like to learn, and then come back with that the next week. This is called All of One Mind. As I bring up the last one here, I'll mention that, of course, there are well-known composers that we all teach that have written similar kinds of dance pieces. Echo Says, the Scottish dance, Alamans from Germany, and so forth. Names like Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven. And many of them wrote pieces that are not much more complex than what we're listening to here. But we tend to pay attention to that group because we know those composers so well. I think in this particular limited genre, Ignatius Sancho matches up, I think, very nicely. But unlike the Mozarts, Haydns, and Beethovens, he was not a career composer. That was not how he spent his life. But the fact that he worked into his life this really significant musical component is something that I just find endlessly fascinating. Okay, at this point, I would like to go back into our history just a little bit before I show you my favorite dance piece of the set. So if you were to look on the internet for this particular video from early dance circle called Celebrating the Music and Dance of Ignatius Sancho, you'll hear quite a bit of educated discussion of his music, not just from this album, but from some others, and you'll see many good dance examples. I wanted to revisit this issue of, well, what do we really know about Ignatius Sancho, and what can we trust from that biography of Mr. Jekyll? There's some oddities about that biography. I mean, when you think about it, this boy's born in a slave ship, he's taken to modern-day South America, and then he's brought to England around age 2 or so and sold into slavery. But prior to getting to England, his mother dies of disease and his father commits suicide out of being so distraught. So that part of the story, up to that point, how does that story survive and even make it to England? Where did Jekyll get that information from? I mean, it's not going to be in a newspaper somewhere, right? You'd think he maybe got it from Ignatius Sancho himself, but where did Sancho get it from? If he got it from anywhere, it would likely be from the sisters who owned him. Are they even trustable? So there's a lot of things about the early part of his life that we have to take with a certain sense of suspicion. One researcher has pointed out, I think quite properly, that, and I'm not an expert in this area of slave history, but in the abolition movement, there were a lot of personal stories that were told as vehicles to help move the movement forward and get rid of this horrible thing called slavery. And so you could see that when one is writing a story for such a purpose, piling on, one horrible event after another would help to maybe make that story even more effective. I mean, the fact that we even have to have stories like that in order to abolish something as horrible as slavery is pretty appalling. But in any case, I think we have to look at that early history with a certain sense of suspicion. But I think it's pretty well established he did, in fact, grow up as a slave and somehow through the Montague family did receive some emancipation. And then following that, we actually have some documented evidence of his existence. This is the birth certificate from 1758 of, and it says right there in the upper left, it may be too light for you to read, Charles Ignatius Sancho, and refers to Anne Osborne, his bride. We know he did own a grocery business, and here's his business card. This is one side of it, and here is the other side. Some who've presented the history of this man find the business card to be a little bit something that's a little hard to talk about, because it's clear that in his business he's selling tobacco, and in one sense he's engaged in an output of the slave trade, even while he's a former slave and an abolitionist himself. But it's one of these difficult situations of how do you move forward in life, and you're dealt a certain hand and you got to play it. But anyway, that's his business card. And you might find this to be rather interesting. I dug this out of the British Museum. This is one of the ballots that represents the vote that Ignatius Sancho cast in one of the elections. And you can see that the whole thing is filled out in one person's handwriting. You didn't just cast a personal ballot that somebody counted. There's a public record, and the list of voters are listed there. And the last one on the list, just above the one that's crossed off, is Ignatius Sancho from Charles Street. It says the occupation is a grocer. He had a chance to vote for any 2 of 3 candidates, and you can see with the horizontal line which candidates he voted for. And it looks like one of them won and one of them lost, if I'm reading the ballot correctly, or at least that's the way it's tallied on that particular piece of paper. That may not be the final tally, I'm not sure. There was an obituary that appeared in the Gazetteer after his death, and this is what it said. About 6 yesterday morning died suddenly Mr. Ignatius Sancho, grocer and tea dealer of Charles Street, Westminster, a man whose generosity and benevolence were far beyond his humble station. He was honored with the friendship of the late Reverend Mr. Sterne and several of the literati of the times. And that term there, the literati of the times, the educated, well-spoken people. Ignatius Sancho was known, as I said, not for his music, but as a, quote, man of letters. And we get that sense here from the obituary. So there's one more piece in this set. It's called Mungo's Delight. And this is not named after somebody he knew. It's not named after a place he visited. You might wonder, what the heck is Mungo's Delight? And I tend to think that this perhaps is a fairly personal piece. There was a play that was taking place in the 1760s in London called The Padlock, and it was about an old man with a young wife, and he keeps her under lock and key because he's afraid she's going to run off with somebody else. And he's got a black servant or slave, I'm not sure, the play may have changed over time, named Mungo, who could be somewhat troublesome. And we know, at least from the biography, that Sancho did have some interest in the theater himself, and this is probably a play that he went and saw. He may have felt a somewhat personal connection to that particular character in the play. I don't know. If you were to scout around doing some research into Mungo, you might come up with this picture, particularly the one on the right, called a Mungo macaroni, in the late Yale Library. This is part of a series of caricatures, and it uses that term Mungo, and it also uses this odd term macaroni. Well, here's a quick explanation on macaroni. Down here in the United States, I don't know how popular it is in Canada, we have this tune called Yankee Doodle that comes from Revolutionary War times, and it has the words in it. Yankee Doodle came to town riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Well, apparently where that comes from is actually from the British soldiers of the Revolutionary War, who are making fun of the colonialists, making fun of them in the sense that they're saying that the colonialists are so stupid, they think that all they have to do is put a feather in their cap and they become a macaroni. So what is a macaroni? A macaroni is a person who dresses in a very high fashion and then goes a few degrees over and beyond that. And we're seeing a gentleman here named Julian Soubise, caricatured here as a Mungo macaroni. Mungo, I guess, because he's black, macaroni because of the audacious way he's dressed. And Julian Soubise was a friend of Ignatius Sancho, and they corresponded, and there's some heartfelt letter in that collection from Sancho to Soubise, talking about, you know, what you've been through as a slave and what I've been through, and how we ought to treat people going forward, and that kind of thing. So with that as a bit of a background, I find this particular piece called Mungo's Delight to be of great interest to me. I'm going to bring it up here on my iPad, and I'm first going to play it for you in the harpsichord version, and then I will make a couple comments about it and play it on the piano version, and we'll conclude at that point. So here we go. Now, what I find especially fascinating about this is the fact that the piece starts off in a minor key and migrates itself to the relative major and ends in the relative major. Now, in my history of learning and studying music, I know of so many pieces that are in major, they switch to parallel minor and back to major, or they do the reverse. Um, and there are, of course, all of those pieces in minor keys that become suddenly major in the last measure with the Picardy third, or the last section switches from minor to parallel major. But for me, it's a real rarity to find one that starts off in minor and changes to a different tonic altogether, which is the relative major, and ends with that. And so musically, I've just found that to be kind of fascinating. And I just wonder if there isn't something of a personal statement in this piece by virtue of the title. I would think that people dancing the piece would have no idea what that personal statement is. It's a very danceable tune. But in any case, here it is on the piano. So there you have it. I hope you've enjoyed a little hour-long tour, giving us an opportunity to get acquainted with a remarkable man named Ignatius Sancho. That particular piece is also featured in that YouTube video that I mentioned, and you can see people dancing to it. It's very interesting.
Thanks so much, George. For our Zoom audience here, I put a link to George's handout in the chat box. If you haven't seen that yet, just go to the chat box and have a look there. I'm also going to put this into the YouTube description, so anyone that's watching later on YouTube, you can access the handout there. Just look under the description of the webinar in YouTube, and you'll see a link there to a Google Drive folder. I'm just looking through the scores myself too on SuperScore, and I love music in 6/8 time. I'm always looking for new music in 6/8 time, and it's interesting to see about half of the music cast in 6/8. So that's one thing that strikes me as interesting, among all the biographical details, of course, that only you can uncover, George, in the way that you do. We really appreciate that. Now, if anyone in the audience here has a question, feel free to raise your hand, perhaps, if you have a comment, and we can bring you on live to chat for a moment, or type into the chat box if you have anything to share. Otherwise, George, that's really enlightening. Can you tell us a little bit, maybe get us primed for the Clementi presentation next week? What do you plan to go through there?
So Muzio Clementi, another transplant to England, started off in Italy, and he ends up as a teenager living with a well-to-do family, and his job is to play the piano all day so he can entertain people at night. And he becomes not only a well-known composer and performer, but he becomes a real educator. And he publishes in 1797 the Opus 36 Sonatinas, and the title specifically says that they are 6 progressive sonatinas. And when you understand that these pieces were published by a company, Longman and Broderick, that also manufactured these new things called the pianoforte, you realize, oh, if you're going to sell these instruments, you got to have music to go along with it. You got to have music that gets harder and harder, so the aspirational pianists can learn to get better and better. Well, around 1800 or so, this company goes bankrupt. Clementi is an investor in it, and he ends up being in charge of the company for the next 30 years. And so Clementi is doing it all. He's performing, he's training the top teachers in England, he's writing method books, he's writing the aspirational pieces, and he's manufacturing the instrument itself, which is getting bigger and bigger throughout the first 20 years of the 19th century. So these six sonatinas are so wildly popular, they get reprinted again and again and again. And by the time Clementi does it for the fifth time, the instrument is no longer the standard 5 octaves, it's clearly a 5.5 octave standard, and Clementi rewrites the music. He transposes passages up an octave, takes advantage of these extra notes, cuts out certain portions, adds in extra music. It's really quite amazing. And so he publishes a 6th and a 7th edition that are basically this revised version. And then when he dies in 1732, another publisher named Purday takes over. And Purday puts out a 7th edition, which is kind of a reconciliation of errors in the 5th and 6th. And that edition is not what publishers today publish. They publish what was basically published in 1797. That's what we're all familiar with. And it can be kind of startling to find out what Clementi's last word on these pieces was. And I'm glad to say that in SuperScore, if you get the edition there, you get both, the original and the revised.
Well, we look forward to that with you and Arthur next week.
Yeah, Arthur's the one who really pioneered this. He was working on sources for this material back in the 1990s, back when you had to, write to libraries and go and visit places and that sort of stuff. Whereas today, so often things have been digitized and you can grab your sources. And I was able to work with him, and then once we started working together, we uncovered a couple other sources that he had not uncovered previously. So it's endlessly fascinating material.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to that next Friday. And thanks for this today. This has been really informative. I know those of you watching later on YouTube as well are going to really enjoy that. And we hope you can check us out next Friday with this talk on Clementi. So hope everyone has a great weekend. I know we're at the top of the hour here. We're sort of at our time. Thanks for joining us here today on CCTV for today's webinar. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you all next Friday. Bye for now.
Thanks for having me.